So we were going to do a comparison of two great Proto-Renaissance masters, Cimabue and Giotto, and compare them by looking at two paintings of the Madonna enthroned, so exactly the same subject.
Now, these are both in the Uffizi in Florence, but originally, of course, there were altar paintings, panels, which are very large. In fact, the Cimabue is
more than 12 feet.
Yeah, it's 12 feet tall. It's huge, and that was so that it could be seen the full distance of the church nave.
That's right, and the Giotto too is more than 10 feet high.
Right, and so they're both very large paintings. The Cimabue is a little earlier. Mm-hmm. It's generally dated 1280, 1290, and Cimabue is the very first artist that Vasari talks about at the very beginning of this incredible tradition of Italian painting.
So Cimabue is really seen to make this sort of first step away from a medieval style toward a more human-focused Renaissance style.
Yeah, and there's a lot of sort of controversy and interest in terms of why the Renaissance has its roots at this particular moment in this particular place. I mean, why in Florence, and why right here at the end
of the 13th
century? And one of the theories that's been put forward is pressure that was being felt in the Byzantine Empire to the east by Islam, and some of the artists perhaps or intellectuals fleeing the great traditions of the East and coming to Italy.
And sort of re-inspiring the arts in Italy.
That's right, exactly. And perhaps prompting it to think beyond the traditions of the medieval. So maybe we should start off by looking at the Cimabue. It's this gigantic painting, all this gold.
Yeah, and you know, the first thing to say is that this is just a really standard subject that we see all the time, right?
The Madonna
Forever and ever and ever. The Madonna,
enthroned.
right, Mary, the mother of Christ, holding the Christ child, surrounded by angels and or saints and prophets. Really standard subject. And yes, lots and lots of gold. These are tempera paintings on wooden panels.
So it's egg tempera.
Right.
And it's using minerals that are suspended in that egg media.
Right.
Right. And there's a really sort of particular quality to that, which is there's a little stippling. You know, it's good for little lines. It's not very. It does not.
Doesn't blend well.
No, it doesn't blend well. It dries quickly. And so there's a really linear aspect to this painting, which may, in some respects, result from the tempera.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, a lot of gold. I mean, this is real gold.
Okay. So this is gold that's been flattened out. It's a very thin gold leaf, and in fact, even tooled. That is to say, patterns have been pounded into it to make it even more interesting.
And then it's been glued onto the wooden panel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been burnished, and sometimes there's a kind of clay layer underneath, which you can sometimes see a little reddish. But the gold itself is really meant as this ornamental, reflective material that had a symbolic quality in that it was meant to reflect the light of heaven.
Right, exactly. These are neither of these are set in any kind of earthly realm. They're, have the flat gold background indicates a kind of divine heavenly space for these figures to occupy.
And that makes sense when you look at the Cimabue, because the Madonna, for instance, she's so, I guess maybe because she's defined by line, and if she stood up, she would be so tall.
She would be very elongated, yes. And her drapery is defined by line primarily, and not as much by modeling from light to dark, although a little bit.
Yeah. So there are some distinct medieval or Byzantine elements that are still visible here. Her fingers are very long, her mouth is very small, the nose is very long.
Those features of her face,
there's
very
old. A kind of symbolism of the body, not a representation of a real person so much as a representation of a kind of ideal heavenly form.
There's no sort of background here. The angels are all stacked kind of on top of one another.
It's a good thing they have wings, isn't it?
Yes.
Because what are they standing on?
I don't know, but we do begin to get some sense of the beginnings of an illusion of space in Cimabue.
A little bit. She's got a little modeling under her chin. And you're right, the throne on which she sits does sort of recede, except here's the funny thing. When you look at the throne carefully, it looks as if we're looking across at the Virgin Mary, but we're looking down at the seat on which she's seated, and in some ways we're also looking up at her. And so there's not a single sort of perspectival point in which the viewer is situated.
Right.
We're sort of all over.
Right. We have sort of multiple viewpoints, and that's something that, of course, will disappear a century later, more than a century later, when we get to Brunelleschi in the early Renaissance.
But I'm not comfortable with the idea that Cimabue couldn't do it.
No.
It's not like he.
No, he's a great painter.
And so I think do you think it has more to do with the fact that it wasn't a goal? that...
Absolutely.
So if he's representing the heavenly, if he's representing not the physical earthly, then...
Why would you have a single viewpoint then?
Because if this is God's sphere, you know,
Right.
that...
This is not about a human looking at it.
Okay, so
This is
that's
about,
really important. That's
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
So what about the four figures underneath?
Yeah, well, I think that it's interesting that they're behind there. It does show some illusion of
It does.
of
It
space.
does. And it kind of frames them as well.
It does. And they're adorable down there, those prophets. You can always tell the prophets because they're holding scrolls.
Okay, so these are Old Testament prophets.
Right. Who would have predicted the coming of a Messiah,
Okay.
of a Christ.
And here, in the Catholic tradition, of course, that would have been understood as Christ, as
Exactly.
you said. Right.
Exactly. And so let's look over now at the Giotto, because things have really changed 20
so
or 30
interesting,
years later.
Because when we first looked at these, they look fairly similar, but now that we've really taken apart the Cimabue.
Yeah. I mean, when I just look from one to the other, the Giotto, the Madonna just looks so massive and bulky, and look at how her hips and her thighs sort of cover that.
And her knee
seat
projects
of
forward.
The throne.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Her breasts are her
And
knees.
look at how differently the drapery is indicated. Instead of by these,
the gold
tiny
striations,
lines,
yeah.
right? We now have real modeling from light to dark to indicate her knees
It's
and
so
her
interesting.
lap, and even how the drapery pulls across her chest and her breasts.
So, you know, when you look back at the Cimabue now, the Madonna looks so thin, almost as if she's a paper cutout. And Giotto's looks, she looks
ethereal,
substantial.
the Cimabue,
Yeah, the Cimabue looks really ethereal. And the Giotto looks so substantial, so solid.
Yeah. And the word that art historians use all the time here, of course, is monumental. She has a kind of monumentality to her.
Yeah, almost overblown,
Yeah,
actually.
it's true.
It's also interesting if you compare the angels, because in the Cimabue, in the earlier painting, the angels are stacked up. They don't sort of respond to gravity. And they're also all very similar. They're sort of an idealized face that's not
Right.
particularly individualized. But if you look at the angels in the Giotto rendering from a few decades later, actually what's really interesting is Giotto is willing to put the angels in back of each other, even obscuring their faces
Right.
by those halos.
By those halos,
Yeah,
right.
and so there's really a sense that one comes before the other that's
Right.
more pronounced
Right.
than in the Cimabue.
And the way that they sort of seem to go back behind the throne is also
In
more
fact,
pronounced. And
there's-
one of
they're
the
even
prophets,
framed,
right? One
yes.
of the prophets is peeking his head through in the back there.
And yeah, the prophets aren't in some sort of impossible
Right.
basement under the throne,
Right.
but now they're actually being framed by the that's right, by the wings
Yeah.
of this more Gothic throne
Yeah,
now.
and look at how much more modeling is in her face and in her neck.
But
Giotto's obviously so interested in modeling.
There's one aspect to this, the painting by Giotto, that I think is really significant and really interesting.
What's that?
And I'm reminded of it by looking at the way in which the wings of the throne are cut out so that we actually can see those prophets. And that is that, remember when we were talking about the Cimabue being seen from all over? In the Giotto, there's a very particular single point that the viewer is looking at this from.
From below, you mean?
Well, I think that if you look, for instance, at the steps moving up to the Virgin, you're looking down at the top of the step clearly. So you know your eyes above that, but you're also looking up at the ceiling of the throne.
Right.
So you're looking.
That's
you're
true.
somewhere in between, and in fact you're looking down at the seat. But you'll notice that just where the prophets' chins are, that's where everything sort of is exactly horizontal.
And we can't see above or below it.
That's right. So that's exactly the line at which our height.
That's true.
And that makes sense because that would put us just below Christ, a nice humble position.
That's true.
And then there's a kind of left-right axis too, which is to say that I think we can see a little bit more
of the right.
of the right window. So I think we're facing Christ,
So
and
you
Christ
think
is
that
facing us.
this begins to situate the viewer and to imply a sort of real human viewer there.
I think that's exactly right. This is not linear perspective, but it's almost
It's
as
kind of a more awareness of the human presence in front of the painting.
I think that's exactly right. And I would probably even go further to say that in 100 years, when linear perspective is really developed, it's based on this.
Ah, really?
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
I don't think that linear perspective would make sense unless the viewer was situated in a particular way.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely implies a situated
it does.
viewer.
And there's a very conscious effort here.
That's true. One of the things that I like to think about is how similar these two images are despite their differences, and the ways in which the understanding of originality was so entirely different than in our own culture.
Right. So this is not so much derivative in a negative sense as we might think in contemporary
Right.
art.
We might think, well, he just, look at all the ways that he copied Cimabue.
Yeah.
But that's not at all the case. In fact, there was a real tradition of the ways that you represent these figures, because these are holy figures, and so you don't mess with the image so much. You're representing God and the Mother of God, and you don't mess with it so much.
And that makes sense. And also, this is very universal. This is something that, in a sense,
it's
it
transcendent.
transcends time, it transcends space,
right?
And so that makes sense.
But even within that, Giotto is still creating this new image, because obviously things are beginning to change in the early 1300s, and we can see that so clearly
here.
So
he must be responding to cultural changes.
Yeah.
That is, putting an emphasis on the here and now
and
in
on
a
the
way
human, right?
that will, of course, blossom into the Renaissance.
Exactly.